Changes have taken place in the past year or two. Let us look back to the days of 1935.
Stretches into its second year, federal troops and their allies are losing ground.
Arrows against poison gas. That's how Haile Selassie and his warrior chiefs fought.
But now, Abiy stands accused of ethnic cleansing and
History of medieval Christianity, the ceremonial gestures of the Ligaba, or
Council will be good enough to excuse me from
Ethiopia is a complicated place. Understatement, really. Even calling this collection of regions and ethnic groups Ethiopia is contentious, as many groups and regions consider themselves to have a long history of autonomy and even view the construction of the Ethiopian central state as a fundamentally colonial and violent endeavor. The Ethiopian state as we understand it was really something that came about fairly recently, even if these groups have been associated with and fighting amongst each other in this region with a somewhat visible and living identity for over 3,000 years. The concept of ethno-federalism, or having these loosely affiliated regions stay fairly autonomous from a central state, is a question that still dominates Ethiopian politics even now, and was a central issue of the Ethiopian student movement, the Marxist movement that eventually became the Ethiopian Revolution in the 1960s and 1970s. A primarily agrarian state landlocked by other Eastern African nations and populated by 80 or so different ethnic groups, Ethiopia is the 12th largest nation in the world. It is the second most populous in Africa next to Nigeria. It also boasts the record of being one of the earliest known cradles of human civilization on this planet. Some of the oldest fossils of early hominids ever found were found right here in Ethiopia. Over time, the nation has left a heavy impact on the world and the black diaspora, both as one of the few African nations to resist successfully the scramble for Africa, as well as additional colonial exploits during World War II, and as the birthplace of Rastafarianism, a Jamaican form of Christianity that exemplifies former Emperor Khadamawe Haile Selassie, with him being the main inspiration and spiritual figurehead of this religion during its formation, as well as claiming to be able to trace his roots back to King Solomon from the Bible himself, as a descendant of King Menelik, the son of Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba.
The most rousing, boisterous, tumultuous welcome ever given to any visiting or local celebrity, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia, arrived. The crowd erupted into a frenzy of rejoicing as they broke through the lines of soldiers and police and surged out onto the tarmac, eager to engulf the emperor with their affections.
Back in 2019, archaeologists in the northern regions of Ethiopia uncovered something. About 30 kilometers from the city of Aksum lays a basilica that has been dated back to the 4th century AD during the reign of the Aksum Empire, around the time that Ethiopia was first ever Christianized. In fact, Ethiopia was the second place to ever be Christianized right after Armenia was in 301 CE, making Ethiopia sit among the oldest seats of Christianity in history, Christianized during the rule of King Ezana or Izan. No, not that one. The Empire of Aksum was one of the world's most influential ancient civilizations, but it remains one of the least widely known, says Michael Harrower of Johns Hopkins University, the archaeologist leading the team. Helena Woldekiros, an archaeologist at St. Louis Washington University, who was part of the team, adds that Aksum served as a nexus point linking the Roman Empire and later the Byzantine Empire with distant lands to the south. That trade by camel, donkey, and boat channeled the silver, olive oil, and wine from the Mediterranean to cities along the Indian Ocean, which in turn brought back exported iron, glass beads, and fruits. The kingdom began its decline in the 8th and 9th centuries, eventually contracting to control only the Ethiopian highlands. Yet it remained defiantly Christian even as Islam spread across the region. At first, relations between the two religions were largely peaceful, but grew more fraught over time. In the 16th century, the kingdom came under attack from Somali and then Ottoman armies, but ultimately regained control of its strategic highlands. Today, nearly half of all Ethiopians are members of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Ethiopia's Christian history is exemplified in the still standing Ethiopian Orthodox Christian Church, which is basically like the Ethiopian equivalent to the Catholic Church. There's also, of course, Rastafarianism. This form of Christian mysticism and political theory first emerged in 1930 after the ascension of Rastafari Makonnen to the throne of Ethiopia, which was in line with a prophecy given by Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican Pan-Africanist activist and writer. The roots of Rastafarianism can be traced to the 18th century, when Ethiopianism and other movements that emphasized and idealized Africa began to take hold among black slaves in the Americas. For those who had been converted to Christianity, the Bible offered hope through such passages as Psalm 68:31, foretelling of how princes shall come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia shall soon stretch her hands out unto God. The ethos was strengthened through the late 19th century rise of the modern Pan-African movement, and particularly the teachings of Jamaican-born Marcus Garvey, who reportedly told his followers, "Look to Africa where a black king shall be crowned. He shall be the Redeemer." Selassie definitely didn't try and stop this myth from spreading, and even visited Jamaica in 1966, sparking crowds hundreds of thousands deep to swarm the tarmac where his plane landed. It also didn't help that it had been raining that day, April 21st, 1966, and when his plane landed, the rain literally stopped. It did help that the people greeting him were smoking the dankest weed ever grown, blessed by the lineage of Solomon himself. Hey yo, anybody trying to spark up? Garvey's prophecy sparked a movement, and to this day a small settlement of both native Ethiopian and black immigrant Rastas, controversially, still live in Ethiopia to this day, even though later in life Garvey looked at Selassie much less favorably, something we'll discuss later. I started off this video wanting to simply do a short summary of the current situation going on in Tigray. For those who don't know, Ethiopia is currently entangled in a war between the Tigray People's Liberation Front, a militia group which controls the Tigray region in the north of Ethiopia, which split off from the federation of ethnic groups and parties that ruled Ethiopia back in 2020 after elections there were postponed by the Ethiopian government due to COVID, as well as other political reshufflings of power that took place when Abiy Ahmed, the current Prime Minister of Ethiopia, took power in April of 2018. To give a very brief and not at all sufficient summary. But as my research went on, I found myself kind of incapable of starting there and ending there, and I realized how incredibly complex and dense Ethiopian political history really is, especially when discussing the Ethiopian revolutions and various often deeply embattled socialist tendencies within the nation. Ethiopia is a place too complex to simply squeeze into a short video. Even the war going on now would be impossible to discuss without delving into over 50 years of complex political upheaval, famine, revolution, counter-revolution, and more. So today we're going to take a deeper look at Ethiopian history than I initially planned, and we will be discussing the years and world events that led up to the Ethiopian Revolution, the revolution itself, the decades impacted by it afterward, and Ethiopia's present. And as always, I'm just some kid who read a book. Do your own research, all of my sources are available. This video is not the be-all end-all for understanding Ethiopia, it's just a stepping stone. And with that said, my name's Anansi, and let's get on with this video. Kadamawe Haile Selassie, name meaning Might of the Trinity, born Rastafari Makonnen, Ras being a title given to his father Ras Makonnen, a governor in the Harar region of Ethiopia, took the throne and became the Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930. Before him, a man named Lijiasu had sat on the throne. But unfortunately for him, Ethiopia was and still is a primarily Christian nation, and Lijiasu's familial ties to Islam made him very unfavorable. He was not only excommunicated from the Orthodox Ethiopian Church, but was fully deposed by his aunt Zuditu, whom Haile Selassie then served under as regent. By 1916, Lijiasu was no longer in power and Selassie was in line for the throne after Zuditu, and big changes were coming down the line for Ethiopia. Haile saw himself as, and to a degree acted as, a liberal reformer, focusing much of his efforts on turning Ethiopia into developed modern world power, while Zuditu was much more conservative and backed by more traditionalist power structures within Ethiopia, most specifically the Ethiopian Church. Ethiopia's more traditional power structures were so against Haile Selassie that they tried and failed to have him deposed, resulting in Selassie seizing full control and being named Negus, or King of Ethiopia, in 1928. Zuditu died 2 years later, fully cementing Selassie's rule.
Base money, fancy clothes, ops and coppers I dispose. Talk slow, lower your tone, if you need an illegal loan.
But while that was going on, Haile Selassie was still working on those reforms and trying to modernize Ethiopia, as previous rulers had also done, for the express purpose of making colonization impossible. Part of how he did this was securing Ethiopia's entrance into the League of Nations. The League of Nations was a precursor to the modern-day United Nations created in the post-World War I aftermath to try and prevent such a large-scale war from happening again. Unfortunately, the League of Nations was essentially toothless, as Selassie would learn the hard way later. And in the case of Ethiopia, colonial powers had been on the prowl in the past after smelling blood in the water when King Menelik II started having severe strokes and his health began to fail entirely back in the 1900s, and even before then when in 1895 Ethiopia fended off an Italian colonial invasion. Expecting chaos and opportunity to follow Menelik's death, Europe was watching closely to protect and expand on their colonial holdings, should they get the chance. In 1906, Italy signed a treaty with France and England that attempted to mitigate the squabbling these three powers were experiencing in North and East Africa over land and control, including in Ethiopia, but it didn't really work out. London's concern in the 1906 treaty was security for the unimpeded flow of the Blue Nile from Lake Sana. After the Battle of Fashoda in 1898, France's interest was limited to the construction of a railroad linking Addis Ababa to the port of Djibouti. Since Ethiopia lacked an outlet to the sea, this railroad, completed in 1917, gave France virtual control over Ethiopian trade with the outside world. Moreover, both nations realized that Italy could only maintain its precarious hold over its two colonies, Eritrea and Somaliland, if the central areas of Ethiopia lay open to Italian economic penetration. The Italians themselves had more grandiose ideas, hoping to build a railroad from one dependency to the other through Ethiopian territory, and ultimately to establish a political protectorate over Ethiopia as well. After considerable negotiations, the three powers compromised by designating a railway line connecting Italy's two colonies, which would run west of Addis Ababa to avoid the French railroad, and acknowledging Britain's intention to construct a dam on Lake Sana in the Italian zone. The 1906 treaty also incorporated the Anglo-Italian protocols of the 24th of March and 15th of April, 1891, in which practically all of Ethiopia, including Lake Sana and the Western European highlands, was recognized as an Italian sphere of influence. In return, Italy agreed to construct no irrigation works on the Nile. The 1906 treaty called for the maintenance of this status quo in Ethiopia and a policy of non-intervention by all three powers. Britain's approval of these conditions was related to its need to safeguard the source of the Blue Nile, since a strong Ethiopia was the best defense against a threat to the Nile and the Suez Canal, just as a strong Turkey was once thought to be the best defense of the Straits and the route to India. Ethiopia was important to her to protect the right bank of the Nile and the left bank of the Red Sea route to India. Italy wouldn't really get what it wanted regardless though, as the treaty failed to curb dispute and no one could really do much until Menelik died. European powers didn't want to challenge an Ethiopia united under his rule, and instead wished to wait until after his death fractured Ethiopia. This didn't happen, as Menelik died in 1913 during a time where Europe was too busy fighting itself to capitalize on the moment. Once the war ended, Italy tried to use the fact that it had backed the Allies in World War I as leverage for a sweeter cut of Africa and Ethiopia, but didn't really get anything. Ever hungry for Ethiopian blood, this didn't stop Italy from continuing to push for more colonial holdings on the continent. Soon after the peace settlement, the Italians approached the British to discuss the Ethiopian situation. After some hesitation, Whitehall agreed to accept a delegation which met at the Foreign Office on 17 November 1919. Italian officials submitted a memorandum inviting Great Britain to consider the backward state of development in Ethiopia and urging it to adopt a policy of efficacious collaboration for the progress of Abyssinia. They promised to back the British for concession for a dam on Lake Sana at the court of Ethiopia in return for reciprocal support for the railway connecting Eritrea with Italian Somaliland. Yet, on the 25th of November, the Foreign Secretary informed Marquis Imperiali, the Italian minister in London, that the far-reaching nature of the compensation question made continuing discussions futile. He suggested they wait until territorial matters were concluded before resuming talks on Ethiopia and Jubaland. Regardless, Selassie's admittance to the League of Nations was halted by the fact that slavery was still a practice in Ethiopia, which pissed off a lot of the quote-unquote civilized white people, even though they had only just gotten rid of slavery themselves, and not really if you want to get into it, but that's a whole nother video. In 1922, a report on the state of the slave trade in Ethiopia was written and published in the Westminster Gazette by a Dr. Sharp, a member of the British legation in Addis Ababa, the capital city of Ethiopia. This drastically exasperated the issue, and the article was republished in multiple other newspapers, including the New York Times, which deeply offended Selassie, who argued that slavery was an Ethiopian tradition. Now, this whole debate is long and interesting, but to keep things short, the British were hesitant to cave to anti-slavery advocates who argued that the way to stave off slavery was strong European leadership, because they feared that the process that would ensue would negatively impact other colonial holdings in Africa and give Italy a stronger foothold in the area, in accordance with the 1906 treaty that carved up Ethiopia in the event of European takeover. And let's not forget that none of these powers even controlled Ethiopia yet. Italy was basically of the exact same feeling when France posed the Ethiopia question to the League of Nations, both England and Italy having their own ideas on the future of Ethiopia. If Ethiopia joined, it would have to abolish slavery, which could, according to Selassie, start a revolution. Selassie submitted his application for membership on August 1st, 1923, continuing the debate. However, it was about this time that Italy switched up their tune. They realized that opposing Ethiopia's entrance would piss off Ethiopia and sour relations, as well as souring relations with other members of the League of Nations, while backing Ethiopia's entrance into the League could basically only benefit them, and screw over the British. By backing Ethiopia, they could make friends in Addis Ababa and tee themselves up for taking over. They also didn't think Ethiopia would actually get approved to join anyway, so officially opposing it was unnecessary. The Italians supported the application only after they realized that they could not muster enough votes to oppose it. Once that decision was made, Mussolini's advisors used the occasion to win friends in Addis Ababa at French expense. On the other hand, they were also able to enlist French support for the Nadi Corfu affair in exchange for a more favorable Italian attitude toward France's occupation of the Ruhr. Moreover, the Italians did not expect the Ethiopian Empire to survive. They foresaw collapse, leading in turn to a mandate in the area and Italy, in accordance with the Treaty of 1906, a major recipient of territory. They had only to wait for the inevitable. By September of 1923, Ethiopia was a member of the League of Nations, with a few caveats. For one, they were still subject to an arms embargo enforced by the Tripartite Treaty signed by England, France, and Italy in 1906, the same one that gave Italy a massive chunk of Ethiopia should it collapse. It was almost 10 years later, on November 23, 1934, when Italy made its move. Light border disputes between Italian forces in Italian Somaliland and Ethiopian people had been ongoing for years as Italy's colonization had persisted. On the aforementioned date, Ethiopian troops and Italian troops clashed to the tune of 200 deaths over control of the Walwal Oasis. This fort never should have been built, as it violated agreements set between Ethiopia and Italy by being built within Ethiopia's borders. This happened in 1930, and Ethiopia tolerated it for a time, all while Italy steadily built up its military presence at Walwal. By 1934, though, that policy had changed, and Ethiopia was knocking on the door of the base on November 23, 1934, with 1,000 troops demanding immediate control of Walwal Fort, sparked to concern by the buildup of military force there. By December 5th, they were trading gunfire over it. This was known as the Abyssinian Crisis, and it was used by Italy to justify a violent and genocidal invasion of Ethiopia. Selassie protested the aggression and sought arbitration from the League of Nations, but conflicting interests between Italy and other major powers and a lack of willingness to bother helping Ethiopia meant that Mussolini's Italy was able to, without consequence, reject all of the numerous forms of arbitration that were offered and fully invade Ethiopia by October of 1935. For Mussolini, this was not only about engaging in a land grab and gaining a colony like other powers. Mussolini specifically wanted to avenge the embarrassment suffered in the late 1800s by the Italians when Ethiopia decimated their army. It didn't help that Italy declared that they would see any arms sales to Ethiopia as an act of aggression, causing England to place an embargo on arms sales to Ethiopia, leaving the nation cut off from the rest of the world, with a comparatively weak, severely underarmed, and understaffed military. Ethiopia was not ready for the Italian fascist invasion, and help was not coming. Especially since, in a move that history would professionally define as ironic, France and England didn't want to piss off Italy because they wanted an ally against Germany. In a desperate plea to the League of Nations, Selassie gave a powerful speech where he essentially asked the question, what is the point of the League's existence if it cannot keep its promises to small nations, if its ulterior motives take the place of justice?
Other plans.
Dès les premiers mots du Négus, des journalistes italiens l'interrompent par des coups de sifflet auxquels répondent de nombreux applaudissements.
The Ethiopian government never expected other governments to shed their soldiers' blood to defend the covenant when their own immediately personal interests were not at stake. Ethiopian warriors asked only for the means to defend themselves. On many occasions, I have asked for financial assistance, for the purchase of arms. That assistance has been constantly refused me. What then, in practice, is the meaning of Article 16 of the Covenant and of collective security? The rules of neutrality should have prohibited transports intended for Italian forces, but there is not even neutrality since Article 16 lays upon every state member of the League the duty not to remain neutral, but to come to the aid of not the aggressor, but the victim of aggression. Has the Covenant been respected? Is it today being respected? Finally, a statement has just been made in their parliaments by the governments of certain powers, amongst them the most influential members of the League of Nations, that since the aggressor has succeeded in occupying a large part of Ethiopian territory, they propose not to continue the application of any economic and financial measures that may have been decided upon against the Italian government. These are the circumstances in which, at the request of the Argentine government, the Assembly of the League of Nations meets to consider the situation created by Italian aggression. I assert that the problem submitted to the Assembly today is as much a wider one. It is not merely a question of the settlement of Italian aggression. It is collective security. It is the very existence of the League of Nations. It is the confidence that each state is to place in international treaties. It is the value of promises made to the small states that their integrity and their independence shall be respected and ensured. It is the principle of the equality of states on the one hand, or otherwise the obligation laid upon small powers to accept the bonds of vassalship. In a word, it is international morality that is at stake. Have the signatures appended to a treaty value only insofar as the signatory powers have a personal, direct, and immediate interest involved? No subtlety can change the problem or shift the grounds of the discussion. It is in all sincerity that I submit these considerations to the Assembly at a time when my people are threatened with extermination, when the support of the League may ward off the final blow. May I be allowed to speak with complete frankness, without reticence and all directness, such as is demanded by the rule of equality as between all states and members of the League. Apart from the kingdom of the Lord, there is not on this earth any nation that is superior to any other. Should it happen that a strong government finds it may, with impunity, destroy a weak people, then the hour strikes for that weak people to appeal to the League of Nations to give its judgment in all freedom. God and history will remember your judgment. Selassie ended this speech with this statement: "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." He was forced to flee Ethiopia for England on May 2nd, 1936, as the Ethiopian military, a force a fraction of the size and power of Italy's army, was defeated, and Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital city, fell. As mentioned in Selassie's appeal, the Italian invasion was brutal to the point of demonic inhumanity. Torture, mutilation, and brutality were rampant, as well as the use of poison gases on civilians, livestock, crops, waterways, and soldiers alike. Crimes that had, a few decades earlier, been decided were illegal when used on Europeans. The most well-known of these brutal events took place on Yekatit 12, or February 19th, in our traditional calendar. This event, known as the Yekatit 12 massacre, was a brutal act of genocide where over 20% of the entire city of Addis Ababa was murdered by Italian fascists. Italians burned homes, lynched Ethiopians, and slaughtered civilians, killing between 20,000 and 30,000 people. Overall, Italy's colonial conquest resulted in the deaths of over 760,000 Ethiopians. The decisive factor in a series of battle victories in 1935 and 1936 was Italy's use of poison gas, delivered by airplanes in both canister and spray form against Ethiopian military and civilian populations. This use of chemicals violated the International Treaty of Montreux, which Italy had signed in 1928 as part of a series of treaties that would be collectively known as the Geneva Conventions. It is estimated that about 4 to 5% of the Ethiopian population of 12 million people lost their lives during the Second Italian occupation. Among the dead were members of the aristocracy, much of the intelligentsia, and priests and deacons from the Debre Libanos monastery. The League of Nations, which, remember, Selassie had gotten Ethiopia membership of back in 1923, voted to recognize Italy's conquest as legitimate, and only the USSR acknowledged Ethiopia as a sovereign nation, with Selassie as its leader in 1940. Eventually, however, Selassie's prophecy came true, and the shattered remains of the Ethiopian population at least got to say a very good "I told you so." Selassie spent the next few years constantly agitating for British aid while living in Bath, England as an exiled emperor. In 1941, he got his wish and went to Sudan to help build up an armed fighting force made up of Ethiopian exiles, and with this force, managed to retake Addis Ababa and regain his throne. On the 16th of April 1938, the British government officially recognized Fascist Italy's occupation of Ethiopia. Little more than 2 years later, however, on the 10th of June 1940, Mussolini declared war on Britain and France, and thereby entered the Second European War. The Duce's Historic Act not surprisingly brought a major shift in British policy. Emperor Haile Selassie, then in exile in England where he had been relegated to the provincial city of Bath, was flown to Sudan. There he arrived at the beginning of July to lead an Ethiopian liberation campaign. The British, at about the same time, accepted the fact that the Ethiopian patriots, whom they had hitherto regarded as little more than shifta or bandits, would be a useful factor in the struggle against the Italians. The patriots were, however, long denied the official status of allies. The stage was thus set for a British attack on the powerful Italian position in East Africa. The assault began in the second half of January 1941, and the emperor was at the same time allowed to advance into Gojam, where the patriots were grudgingly recognized as allies. The Italians, despite their apparent considerable military superiority, were isolated from metropolitan Italy and demoralized by continued Ethiopian patriot activity. The result was that their regime collapsed after little more than 3 months of fighting. Don't get confused here. The British didn't join the war on Ethiopia's side in 1941 out of the kindness of their hearts, but more like out of a desire to protect their colonial holdings and wallets that were invested in them in other parts of Africa such as Uganda and Egypt. With Addis Ababa back in the hands of Ethiopian rule, Haile Selassie returned on May 5th of 1941. By 1944, Ethiopia was recognized by England as its own nation, and in 1947, Italy was forced to do the same under the treaty signed after World War II ended and Mussolini was redacted. It took so long for Ethiopia to be seen as an independent power again because basically when Italy invaded back in 1935, the British saw it as legitimate conquest, and when they took over Ethiopia after liberating it from the Italians, they considered it occupied enemy territory, which meant that Ethiopia was essentially under British control, almost as a colony. Ethiopia's resources and infrastructure was seen as being available for exploitation at the discretion of the British. It didn't help that colonial-minded generals who had previously overseen colonies in places like British-controlled Uganda were placed in charge of Ethiopia, and the infrastructure built up by the Italians in the 5 years they had been in control would serve the British well throughout the rest of the war. At the end of the war, they made sure Ethiopia saw no benefit or use from what the Italians left behind, pulling the oldest British trick in the book, stealing everything that wasn't fucking nailed down, that had happened to be built by the Italians. This policy was laid out in a directive from the British War Office that essentially said that Ethiopia had no right to any of the resources left behind by the Italians. This meant weapons, supplies, factories, and whatever else they left behind. Ethiopia had no right to any of them. Firstly, they declared that Ethiopia was far from the Middle Eastern war front, then fluctuating between Egypt and Libya, and that the industrial output from the country could therefore not easily be dispatched to North Africa to assist the war effort. This argument failed to take into account of the fact that many of the products of Ethiopian industry were not in fact needed in the war zone at all, and that some Ethiopian installations were later taken or planned to be taken to territories such as Kenya, South Africa, or India, which were very much further than Ethiopia was from the war zone. Secondly, they argue that Ethiopian industries had been set up for an Italian population which had or was about to be deported, and that Italian installations in the country had therefore lost their raison d'etre. This contention ignored the fact that many articles produced by Italian factories were in considerable demand among both Ethiopians and non-Italian resident foreigners. Thirdly, they argued that in the absence of Italian workers, many factories and other plants would become unworkable and would indeed be stolen or gradually rust away. This thesis took no account of the possibility of Ethiopia importing skilled workers from countries other than Italy, or of training Ethiopians for the work in question. Fourthly, they argued that some Italian installations could be dismantled only with the help of Italian workers, and that the removal of such a plant had therefore to be carried out speedily before the latter's departure. And fifthly, they argued that Ethiopia would sooner or later become independent, as foreshadowed in Mr. Eden's statement, and that for this reason, disposal of Italian assets should be effected quickly while the going, so to speak, was good. Plans for dismantling Italian industries developed fast. The Italian fascist surrender at Gondar on the 27th of November 1941 marked the end of the British East Africa campaign. 5 days later, the British military authorities made their first detailed proposals for the dismantling of Italian assets in Ethiopia. They also expelled almost the entire Italian population from Ethiopia, which is funny to me because if you suggest doing something similar now, people get really weird about it. British control over Ethiopia in the post-war period basically amounted to some form of neo-colonialism. The first interim Anglo-Ethiopian agreement, established in 31 January 1942, ensured England maintained control over Ethiopian finances and banking, imposed the East African shilling as the currency, and also maintained occupation of the Ogaden and Hald regions of Ethiopia, as well as the lands bordering French Somalia and the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railroad. It was signed on behalf of the British government by one Major General Philip Ewan Mitchell, the chief political officer of the East African British Forces High Command. Ethiopia wasn't entirely shafted. They still got military aid and advisors who stayed behind to help maintain control and assist the newly reinstated government, but it was still clear who the deal favored. If Ethiopia wanted real independence again, they would need to negotiate this deal and find sources of military aid outside of England to reduce their dependence. The answer to the second question came when the US allowed Ethiopia to receive from its Lend-Lease program, which saw aid, weapons, rations, oil, and other supplies sent out to American allies during World War II. In 1944, the Ethiopian government tried to offer new proposals for negotiations, but were rejected. Another agreement was put forward, and after a few months of deliberations, the Second Anglo-Ethiopian Agreement was signed on December 19th of 1944. Now, I'll be honest, as someone who swings very far left, I'm not a fan of emperors, but it's hard not to feel for Selassie as a diplomat when white people were writing condescending articles like this one about him and his country. In his Porticiod Gebi imperial palace overlooking Addis Ababa, bearded Haile Selassie, King of Kings, Lion of Judah, Emperor of Ethiopia, looked upon his savage subjects with satisfaction. In his hands after 12 long months was a new agreement, signed and sealed by the British minister for the first time since the Italians swooped on Ethiopia like a buzzing deadly locust swarm 9 years ago. His country was again independent, or close to it. The sensitive-spirited Negus was grateful to Britain for sheltering him in his exile, for reconquering his craggy kingdom for him. But for a long time, Haile Selassie, a proud man, had longed for the absolute authority he once had. In the interim, Britain had guided his affairs of state, protected his frontiers, helped restore his war-torn towns, and even put down tribal rebellions. There were also disturbing whispers that Britain was planning to mold a greater Somaliland out of British and Italian Somaliland, with a slice of Ethiopia included. Haile Selassie wanted less help in managing his own affairs. But regardless of the lazy words of Western racists, by 1955 the British occupation was fully over. The Ogaden and Hald regions returned to Ethiopian hands, and Haile Selassie was back in power, and he intended to start exactly where he left off in 1935. Haile Selassie, the King of Kings, finally had his throne, and he had zero time to waste. Unfortunately for him, there were equally savvy, more competent, and close-by forces gathering that would complicate his plans, and he himself would be sowing their seeds. After the war ended and Ethiopia was restored to its pre-war borders, Selassie got busy. He immediately undertook efforts to centralize his power and build up the Ethiopian state to match the power of other developed countries. And as before the war, he faced much opposition. The war with Italy in World War II was a diversion on the course of Ethiopian history, essentially putting on pause a process that continued exactly where it left off as soon as Selassie was back in power. To give a brief rundown, Ethiopia in this period was in a similar situation to Russia right before its revolution. Like Tsar Nicholas II, Haile Selassie was realizing that while his neighbors were modernizing and essentially building themselves up to become modern, somewhat liberal capitalist powers, his country was still stuck deeply in feudalism, controlled fairly heavily by an Orthodox Christian church, and attempts to modernize were being frustrated by a number of factors, all while the people starved and struggled in feudal poverty enforced by rich landowning nobles. Selassie's goal was to modernize and build up Ethiopia, primarily through building up a central government. This meant a need for more government officials, new taxes, and new positions such as police. One important step he took was participating in the creation of the Organization for African Unity, or OAU, in 1963. This organization was made up of 32 independent African states, including Ethiopia, an effort spearheaded by Ghanaian leader Kwame Nkrumah, and formed on May 25th in Addis Ababa. The goal of this organization was to protect human rights in Africa, ensure peace, resist colonialism, and settle disputes between nations. Ironically, this organization faced the same issues as the League of Nations, a lack of military power to enforce its goals, and differing agendas making actual material action incredibly slow. There were also splits between the progressive Casablanca bloc, say that 5 times fast, made up of Ghana, Libya, Algeria, Mali, Guinea, and Morocco, and the more economically minded and conservative Monrovian bloc, made up of Nigeria, Ethiopia, Liberia, and a few other countries that were former French colonies. Eventually, this organization was reformed to be more effective by Muammar al-Gaddafi in the early 2000s. One of the most significant, for reasons that will be apparent in part 2, things that Selassie did to help modernize Ethiopia was establishing the Haile Selassie University in Addis Ababa in 1950. It was a pretty common tradition in Ethiopia for young elites and nobility to be expected to get this kind of education before growing older and taking up positions within the government. And that's essentially what the school existed to encourage. They were part of Selassie's plan to modernize Ethiopia, vital to it since expanding the central government meant you needed more officials to fill those expansions, which meant you needed more educated, qualified people. He also created a national judicial branch of government and appointed judges to it. Aside from the students, Selassie also created tax reforms and land reforms that were less popularly received. In 1942, Selassie declared a new land tax system that would set rates based on the fertility of the land, ranked as fertile, semi-fertile, or poor, dividing them into gashas, or sections of 40 hectares of land. The landlords and nobles in Gojam, Tigray, and Begamdir, however, protested this taxation heavily, and Selassie quickly folded, excluding those provinces from taxes, which then led to others being exempted, and a 10% flat tax on all land except that of the church. The taxes essentially ended up being passed from the landlord to the tenant because fuck the poor. These taxes existed in the first place to provide the funds necessary to continue Selassie's efforts at centralizing government power. Facing consistent political challenges from other nobility, he wanted to shore up his own power and control over the nation. Despite this though, Selassie was often forced to compromise, facing resistance from Tigrayan and Amhara nobles, the church, and the progressive wing of political power that was slowly forming due to those students that he'd put in school since the 1950s, some of which had begun to come of age in the mid to late 1950s and early 1960s. In 1955, Selassie established a new constitution that centralized his power, which partially came in response to international pressure from faster developing, more outwardly democratic appearing countries, and that aforementioned progressive wing of younger post-war educated youth. The 1955 constitution was prompted, like its 1931 predecessor, by a concern with international opinion. Such opinion was particularly important during a time when some neighboring African states were rapidly advancing under European colonial tutelage, and Ethiopia was pressing its claims on internationality for the incorporation of Eritrea, where an elected parliament and more modern administration had existed since 1952. The bicameral Ethiopian parliament played no part in drawing up the 1955 constitution, which, far from limiting the emperor's control, emphasized the religious origins of imperial power and extended the centralization process. The Senate remained appointive, but the Chamber of Deputies was at least nominally elected. However, the absence of a census, the near total illiteracy of the population, and the domination of the countryside by the nobility meant that the majority of the candidates who sought election in 1957 were in effect chosen by the elite. The Chamber of Deputies was not altogether a rubber stamp, at times discussing bills and questioning state ministers. However, provisions in the Constitution that guaranteed personal freedoms and liberties, including a freedom of assembly, movement, and speech, and the due process of law, were so far removed from the realities of Ethiopian life that no group or individual sought to act upon them publicly. Despite the fact that in this period Selassie was seen by many among the black diaspora's Rasta population as a living god and the black messiah, in his own home, Selassie was seen as a dictator, an emperor propping up Ethiopia's elite nobility while her people starved and struggled. Marcus Garvey changed his mind on this later on, but in the past when Rastafarianism was growing, he rightly called out Selassie for his more authoritarian tendencies, saying this: "It is preferable for the Abyssinian Negroes and the Negroes of the world to work for the restoration and freedom of the country without the assistance of Selassie, because at best he is but a slave master. The Negroes of the Western world, whose forefathers suffered for 300 years under the terrors of slavery, ought to be able to appreciate what freedom means. Surely they cannot feel justified in supporting any system that would hold their brothers in slavery in another country whilst they are enjoying the benefits of freedom elsewhere. The Africans who are free can also appreciate the position of slaves in Abyssinia. What right has the emperor to keep slaves when all of the democratic sections of the world were free? When men had the right to live, to develop, to expand, to enjoy all the benefits of human liberty. Like I said, he changed his mind after Selassie outlawed slavery, but this sentiment expressed showed that Selassie's more violent and controlling activities were present before and noticed, even as others downplayed it in favor of outright worship and obedience. In 1960, Dramane Niue, a politician who had in the past been suspended from his governor position in Wolamo due to policies he put in place to help poor people that pissed off the fuck the poor wing of the Ethiopian government, and his brother Mengistu Niue, an Ethiopian imperial guard leader with a very ironic name, organized a coup attempt to end the oppression of Ethiopia's poor masses by the emperor and the feudal government he defended. Before resorting to a coup, Dramane tried to use his position to enact policies that would help the poor, giving away government-owned land and reducing the amount of free labor required of Ethiopian peasantry. This got him removed from office in Wolamo and placed in Jijiga, another town, instead. He did the exact same thing there, as well as going after ineffective political leadership there, and this time faced direct intervention in his activities from Addis Ababa. He concluded that only violence could free Ethiopia's people, and convinced his brother Mengistu to help. The coup was launched on the 13th of December. The Crown Guard took the Empress and the Crown Prince as well as other politicians and held them hostage in the royal palace. They took over and shut down airports, took over the telephone exchange, and blocked roads leading to the palace. Meanwhile, loyalist forces gathered and prepared to take back the city while informing Haile Selassie, who was in Brazil at the time, of what was happening. Unfortunately, the coup was not well organized. Many of the imperial guards gave up when they found out they were fighting the emperor, and there was little public support for the coup. They were expecting the people to rise up and take to the streets, but out of fear, ambivalence, or both, it didn't happen. The Ethiopian students, however, displaying a prematurely born version of the future student movement, did show support and marched in the streets in support of the coup. However, as many student movements do, they lost all of their fervor as soon as they saw enemy soldiers. There was no popular uprising to save the Niue brothers' coup. Things were looking pretty bad. It was a situation similar to what was faced by John Brown in pre-Civil War America, with a freedom fighter desperately trying to start a revolution, but the people he was fighting for lacking the resources and ability to join in. The situation ends just as tragically. When this failed, the conscriptors went on the radio and reported that the students had been massacred by the army, but this act of desperation did not work. By this time, loyalist forces had outnumbered the bodyguard. The Air Force flew jets and dropped leaflets denouncing the actions of the bodyguard. On-the-ground fighting had begun and the army was able to take the airport. The Americans also decided to join the loyalist camp and flew reconnaissance planes and provided access to their international communications network. On the final day of the coup, the 16th, the Air Force began dropping bombs and ground forces began their attacks on bodyguard headquarters. Knowing by this point that they were on the verge of defeat, the conscriptors asked the Americans to mediate. Fighting stopped while Dramane and representatives from the army met at the U.S. Embassy. However, the army knew that they had the upper hand and they would not accept anything less than immediate surrender, and as a result, nothing came of the meeting. Fighting resumed, and before the day ended, conspirators lost hope and fled. Just before departing, they shot and killed 15 of their hostages. By this time, Haile Selassie also reached Eritrea. The next day, on the 17th, he reached Addis Ababa to the seat of his throne. Over the next few months, he promoted Asrate Kassa, married Mengesh and others who had been loyal to him. He also had to increase the army's salary, hoping to quiet those who may have sympathized with the conspirators. Official casualties were 342 dead and 785 injured. Dramane was killed in fighting, and Mengistu was captured and later prosecuted and executed, while Workneh took his own life. Dramane Niue and Mengistu Niue were not the only ambitious freedom-seeking political forces whose hopes Haile Selassie had crushed in the 1960s. One of the greatest examples in this time was his treatment of Eritrea, a region that has on-again off-again faced violence from and been part of its southern neighbor. Eritrea had been taken over by the Italians back in 1889, but before then had been an on-again off-again part of Ethiopia since Ethiopia was still called Damat. Ever since Ethiopia was still called Damat, with other smaller kingdoms controlling parts of it and having various levels of autonomy from Ethiopia. Post-World War II, Eritrea was placed under British military administration in 1941. In 1947, when the Treaty of Peace came into effect, the Four Powers Commission, a group of major powers that included the US, the Soviet Union, England, and France, set about on the duty to create a government in Eritrea. On December 2, 1950, the UN General Assembly approved a resolution by a vote of 46 to 10-4 to federate Eritrea into Ethiopia, essentially meaning that Eritrea had some internal autonomy but was still under the Ethiopian crown. This move was especially beneficial for Selassie, who got access to the sea, and the US, who got to place bases in Asmara and Mitsawa. On March 16, 1952, the Eritrean Representative Assembly was elected to office and subsequently held its first vote to ratify a constitution they had drafted on July 10, 1952. Haile Selassie ratified said constitution on August 11th and officially federated Eritrea on September 15th of that same year. New to this kind of independence and eager to define what it meant to be Eritrea in this period, the Eritrean government made some pretty sweeping changes, especially to acknowledge ethnic and religious tensions and identities in the region. They made English, Tigrinya, and Arabic the two official languages and allowed local communities to decide what languages people would be taught, and also took steps to ensure that Muslim and Christian representation in government were fairly equal. That's not to say there weren't tensions, which came mostly due to Ethiopia and the work of those who supported it having greater control over Eritrea. For one, the chief executive Ato Tedla Bayru was a member of the pro-Ethiopia Unionist Party and was essentially pushing for policies that lessened Eritrean autonomy and increased its association with Ethiopia, which was very much the opposite of what most Eritrean people wanted, especially since Ethiopia's government was not friendly to Muslims nor to Eritreans, who faced an economy deliberately constructed and liberalized to disadvantage them. It also didn't help that our boy Haile Selassie continued to do his thing meaning making sure no one else but him had real political power by any means necessary. On September 30th, 1952, Emperor Haile Selassie issued a proclamation declaring the Federal Ethiopian Court to be the final court of appeal in Eritrea. The Eritrean Assembly adopted a resolution condemning Ethiopian interference in Eritrean affairs. On May 22, 1954, Emperor Haile Selassie forced the resignation of Chief Executive Ato Tedla Bayru in July 1955. Haile Selassie appointed Asfea Woldemichael as Chief Executive and Idris Mohammed Adim as President of the Eritrean Assembly in August of 1955. Selassie's government's treatment of Eritrean peoples and harassment of pro-independence politicians and thought leaders led many of them to flee the country, and greater tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea. The federation hadn't even lasted 3 years before Selassie was exerting major control, and it didn't last 8 before federation became less literal and more of a nicer way of saying colonization, which, to those who idealize Selassie as an anti-imperialist and anti-colonial war hero, was shocking to say the least. But those who were paying attention were less surprised. Judging by his actions, Selassie's ideas on colonialism were low-key a little less, not at all, and a little more, but not me though, right? Ethiopians were anxious to eliminate any traces of separatism in Eritrea, and to that end they harassed the leaders of the independence movement until many of them fled abroad. With the collaboration of their unionist allies and an express violation of the constitution, they also suppressed all attempts to form autonomous Eritrean organizations. Political parties were banned in 1955, trade unions were banned in 1958, and in 1959, the name Eritrean government was changed to Eritrean administration, and Ethiopian law was imposed. Eventually, even Ethiopia's Eritrean allies were alienated by crude intervention in the running of the Eritrean administration, by financial disputes between Asmara and Addis Ababa, and by mounting pressure on the Eritreans to renounce their autonomy. The federation was already dead when, on November 14, 1962, the Ethiopian Parliament and Eritrean Assembly voted unanimously for the abolition of Eritrea's federal status, making Eritrea a simple province of the Ethiopian Empire. Soon afterward, Tigrinya was banned in education, and it was replaced by Amharic, which at the time was the official language of Ethiopia. All of this treatment basically meant that Selassie and Ethiopia were basically begging for it, when in 1962, fed-up Eritreans did what all people who face oppressive and prejudiced colonial government should do. They formed the Eritrean Liberation Front, declared into existence by the many Eritrean exiles who now made it their life's mission to go sicko mode on the Ethiopian military. ELF's official birth took place in Cairo on July 10, 1960, with exiled Eritreans Idris Mohammed Adim, Idris Osman Geladewos, and Mohammed Saleh Hamid. For the next 30 years, the ELF would wage war for Eritrea's independence. The Ethiopian state did its best to paint these rebels as a tool of greater Arab states to weaken Ethiopia, especially since the ELF received support from countries like The Ethiopian state did its best to paint these rebels as a tool of greater Arab states to weaken Ethiopia, especially since the ELF received support from countries like Iran, Sudan, and Syria, hoping to turn Eritrean Christians against the movement and rally Ethiopian Christians to nationalist fervor. It worked in Ethiopia, but in Eritrea, a mostly Muslim country with a strong multi-religious and ethnic nationalist independence movement, it didn't really work. Banning their languages and suppressing their labor movements and efforts for independence in the government throughout the late 50s and early 60s had really destroyed any chance of that working. The Eritrean movement for independence was the first of its kind in Ethiopia, but it would not be the last, and support from other similarly minded people was coming down the line, especially from those who had been educated by Haile Selassie's university, who were just beginning to give birth to something that would change Ethiopia forever: the Ethiopian student movement. So come back for part 2, where Selassie meets his match, Eritrea goes to war, and the students finally take their place on the stage of Ethiopian history.
Base money, fancy clothes, ops and coppers I dispose. Talk slow, lower your tone if you need an illegal